Good afternoon, and welcome to the Cato Institute. My name is Michael Cannon. I'm the Director of Health Policy Studies here at Cato. And I want to thank you for joining us for what I think will be a very important and stimulating discussion about a very important topic in health policy and also federal budgetary policy, which is how much the Medicare program pays for prescription drugs. And I'm particularly excited to be having this conversation with our panel today. I'll go ahead and introduce them now. I'll start with the woman to my left, Pragya Kakani, who is a professor of population health sciences at Weill Cornell Medical College. Am I pronouncing that correct, Pragya?
But it's okay.
Wild. I always get that wrong. I'm very excited to have Pragya here, not just because Pragya contributed a very important article to the literature on prescription drug pricing in Medicare, but I'm also very excited to have Pragya here because Pragya, in addition to many other accolades I could read, is a former Cato Institute health policy intern, making her the first former Cato Institute health policy intern, to my knowledge, to return to the Cato Institute to present her work here in the Hayek Auditorium. So Pragya, welcome back. It is great to have you back.
Thank you so much.
I'm also happy to be here with Luca Maini, who is a professor of healthcare policy in the Department of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. Luca has also made an important contribution to the literature on Medicare prescription drug pricing, an article in Health Affairs on Medicare Part D benefit design and biosimilar coverage, and how that design has affected drug pricing. Luca, welcome and thank you for joining us. Both Pragya and Luca are going to be presenting their papers after I do provide some introductory remarks about why we're here to discuss this very important issue. So, to dive right into to those introductory remarks, let's see, am I advancing it? Yes, okay. First, what we're going to be talking about, first what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go through some basics of the Medicare program and Medicare prescription drug spending, and then I'm gonna raise some questions about, is Medicare paying the right amount or maybe too much for prescription drugs? There's some people who think that it is paying too much, that the prices that Medicare is paying for prescription drugs or subsidizing are too high, and I'll have a couple words to say about some recent efforts by Congress to try to reduce the prices that Medicare is paying for pharmaceuticals. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, about which Luca will have even more to say, and the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which is the subject of Pragya's paper and about which she will have more to say. Then I'm going to just give an overview of some of the parameters of the of certain provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that have to do with Medicare negotiating lower prices for prescription drugs, because those provisions or those parameters will come up later. And then I'm going to finish setting the table with some observations on the rhetoric that's surrounding the debate over prescription drugs and prescription drug pricing in Medicare, to try to cut through that rhetoric and clarify what's actually happening. Okay, so to get rolling, the Medicare program covers about 66 million people, or 19% of the U.S. population. It spends about $16,000 per enrollee, which may not sound like a lot, but across 66 million people, pretty soon you're talking about real money. The total spending is about $1 trillion or more, which is almost a quarter of national health expenditures in the United States. So this is real money we're talking about. It accounts for about a 4% share of GDP. So it's a significant chunk of U.S. GDP. But I want to draw your attention to the last bullet, most of all, because that is the Medicare program's prediction of the average annual growth rate in Medicare spending over the next several years. It'll be growing at a rate, they estimate, of 7.8% per year, which is faster than they project the U.S. economy will grow. And that's important because, as these charts from the Congressional Budget Office illustrate, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is already at about 100%. That means the federal debt is about the size of the entire U.S. economy, and it is growing. It is growing. The federal deficit is growing as a share of the economy. It's growing faster than GDP, adding to the national debt, which is already in uncharted territory. If it keeps rising, we really don't know what's going to happen, but that it does pose a significant threat to the U.S. economy. And the main thing that is driving federal deficits and the growth in the federal debt is healthcare spending. It's healthcare spending at the federal level. If you look at these other graphs from the Congressional Budget Office, you'll see they show that federal outlays as a share of GDP and by category, and there's only two categories where federal outlays are growing as a share of GDP. One of them is net interest on the federal debt, and the reason that is growing is largely because of the other category that's growing as a share of GDP, which is major healthcare programs. And the reason major healthcare programs, so the reason that the main reason that federal deficits are growing as a share of GDP is healthcare spending, and the main reason that federal healthcare spending is growing as a share of GDP is the Medicare program. And there's always the predictable objection or retort that Medicare or spending generally is not the problem, that really the underlying problem when it comes to federal deficits is insufficient federal revenues. And certainly federal revenues are important. The deficit is the difference between outlays and revenues. However, I just wanted to call your attention to this last graph by the Congressional Budget Office, which illustrates that while federal revenues are currently as a share of GDP, are currently at their historic average, or at least over the past 50 years, their historic average, federal outlays are a couple percentage points higher than their average as a share of GDP over the past 50 years, which suggests that while both revenues and spending are contributing to to growing federal deficits, outlays or spending appears to be the larger of those two problems. Okay, well, now why are we focusing on prescription drug spending in the Medicare program? Well, it turns out this is a significant chunk of Medicare spending. The Medicare program estimates that Medicare in 2024 will spend about $146 billion on prescription drugs. Did we decide if that was just Part D or Part D net of rebates, but not Part B? Is that what we decided?
I think we decided it's an attempt at Part D net of rebates.
It's hard to figure out exactly sometimes how much Medicare is spending on prescription drugs, and sometimes, or that's arguably by design. But as a share of total Medicare outlays, it's about 13%, and and Medicare spending on prescription drugs is about a third of overall spending on prescription drugs in the United States. But again, I want to draw your attention to the growth projections in Medicare prescription drug spending. You will notice that for the next 3 years, this year and the next 2 years, the Medicare program predicts that growth in prescription drug spending by Medicare will it'll be growing. That category of spending will grow even faster than overall spending in the Medicare program. And this is significant for the laws that, when it comes to examining the laws that we're going to be examining in Congress's efforts to try to contain Medicare spending on prescription drugs. But for the moment, just keep in mind, it's growing at a pretty rapid clip. So the question arises, is Medicare paying too much? Is the reason that Medicare spends so much on prescription drugs and prescription drug spending in Medicare is growing so rapidly, is because the prices that Medicare is paying are excessive? There's evidence to suggest that maybe that is the case. In 2018, the Trump Department of Health and Human Services put out a study of Medicare, the prices that Medicare pays for drugs that physicians administer to patients, what we call Part B drugs. And they estimated that the Medicare program pays about twice as much as payers in other countries pay for the same drugs. The Government Accountability Office a few years ago put together a study on the prices that the VA, the Veterans Health Administration, pays for drugs versus the prices that Medicare Part D pays for drugs. This is different from the Part B program I just mentioned. But the Part D part of Medicare pays, on average, more than double what the Veterans Health Administration pays for the same drugs. However you slice these data, if the VA were to pay the same prices as Medicare, the prices that it pays for those drugs would double. So how much should Medicare be paying for these drugs? Well, conceptually, that's a fairly straightforward or simple question. Because in the United States, we have a patent system that tries to embed in the price of new drugs or grants patent holders marketing exclusivity so that they can recoup the cost of researching and developing innovative new drugs, and embed in the prices of those new drugs the incentives necessary to undertake those investments. Given that we have a patent system, the right price, the socially optimal price for drugs is whatever encourages innovator drug companies to invest in innovations all the way up to the point where any more innovation would cost more than the benefits it would deliver. So whatever the price is that encourages innovators to keep investing in innovation until the total social cost of innovation or the total social cost of that last unit of innovation equals the total social value of that last unit of innovation. Simple, right? Because if the price is too low, so that's where you want the price to be, because if the price is too low, you're going to get too little innovation, and what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to suffer unnecessarily when if we had encouraged more innovation, there would be more drugs available on the market to treat and cure illnesses. But if the prices are too low, you're going to get a suboptimal level of innovation. People are going to be suffering and even dying prematurely because we got the prices too low. However, by the same token, it's also possible that we might be getting the prices too high. And if you get the prices too high, you create similar problems. Society ends up devoting resources to drug innovation that would produce more human happiness someplace else. We will get additional drug innovation if the prices are too high, but a lot of that innovation will produce benefits, but it will produce benefits the cost of those innovations will exceed the benefits. So the benefits will not justify the cost, and there is some evidence that the Medicare program might be paying prices that are so high that we're getting this sort of innovation. The economists Pisanko, Drenov, and Garthwaite in 2016 looked at oncology drugs and concluded that Medicare Part D might have allowed firms to capture more value than their products created. That's another way of saying we might be over here in this zone where the prices are too high and we're getting excessive levels of innovation where the costs of that innovation exceed the benefits. They say while there are worries that if Medicare reduces the prices it pays for prescription drugs, we might reduce social welfare because we would get less innovation. Keep in mind that some existing regulations may provide incentives for innovation that are themselves not welfare maximizing because they are based on prices that exceed value. So we might be getting inefficiently high levels of innovation all the way up here. Okay. So Congress is aware of these concerns, and Congress has done a number of things to try to reduce the prices that Medicare pays for prescription drugs. One of Congress's efforts, and every time Congress does this, however, every piece of legislation Congress passes that has provisions that try to reduce Medicare drug prices is sort of a mixed bag. There are provisions in each of these bills that would tend to reduce the prices that Medicare pays, and other provisions that would tend to increase the prices. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, about which Luca will be saying more, is one of those laws. It had some provisions that would tend to increase the prices that Medicare pays, such as increasing subsidies for drugs by reducing enrollees' out-of-pocket exposure, but other provisions that would reduce prices, including mandatory price reductions in what we call the coverage gap. And Luca will be saying more about what that coverage gap in Part D is. And he's going to be presenting on what I've got there in the last bullet, which is the provisions of the Bipartisan Budget Act that increase insurers' incentives to cover lower-cost biosimilars versus branded biologics. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, another mixed bag. Some provisions would tend to increase prices, such as capping enrollee out-of-pocket spending on insulin. Rather than run through the entire list, I'll skip right to the end. That's the provision that Pragya is going to be talking about, which is the provision that has been very much in the news of the Inflation Reduction Act that allows the Medicare bureaucracy to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs, basically by telling drug makers that the Medicare, if they don't agree to lower prices, the Medicare program will not cover their products. The way those negotiations work is Medicare picked 10 drugs for which it will negotiate the prices with the manufacturers in August of last year. Those negotiations are ongoing right now, and by 2026, Medicare will be paying the new negotiated prices for those drugs. But before that, in 2025, Medicare will pick another 15 drugs to negotiate lower prices for those drugs, and then in 2026, another 15, and lather, rinse, repeat. We'll have this ongoing cycle where they'll keep picking more and more drugs and hopefully negotiating lower prices to the point where I think in 2029 there will be 80. If my math is right, there will be 80 drugs that Medicare should, if things go according to plan, be paying lower prices for. There are all sorts of restrictions, though, on Medicare's ability to do this, and Pragya will be talking about what those are. But the takeaway is that the Congressional Budget Office, and many of these are limitations on Medicare's ability to get the prices down. But the Congressional Budget Office projects that, on average, Medicare will be paying 50% less for these drugs that it purchased, for these drugs that it selected, than it would have been paying if the IRA had not passed. So now, to cut through some of the rhetoric that has been surrounding this debate over Medicare drug pricing, first, the Medicare program, a lot of people will say that Medicare has never before negotiated drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's inaccurate and really paints a misleading picture of what's been happening in the Medicare program. Because Medicare has been negotiating drug prices with drug makers for its entire 48-year history. It's just been conducting those negotiations at the level of lawmaking, at the level of statute, rather than at the level of the bureaucracy going out and making these and doing these negotiations with the drug companies. And what has been happening for the past 48 years is that Congress has been negotiating with the drug companies at the level of statute, and Congress, or at least the taxpayers, have been losing. Congress is not very good at these negotiations, which is why there are so many indications that the prices that Medicare pays for prescription drugs are so high, and that has led to so much frustration that Congress has finally farmed that job out to the Medicare bureaucracy, hoping that the Medicare bureaucracy will do a better job than Congress has. This is not unlike, since we're in the Hayek Auditorium at the Cato Institute, this is not unlike what Friedrich Hayek wrote about in The Road to Serfdom, where he described the process of central economic planning and how legislatures might set broad goals but then are incapable of pursuing those goals in a competent or efficient way because of the political constraints that they face and the information and incentive problems. And so then they then farm out those decisions to non-legislative bodies to make those decisions for the government. That's something like what is happening with Medicare drug pricing right now. Another claim that you'll hear in these debates is that the prices that Medicare is paying right now are market prices, and if Medicare reduces the prices that it pays to drug companies, then those will be price controls or below market prices. But I think it's pretty clear, and there was an article, I think, in the New England Journal of Medicine recently, was that where David and Richard's article, that very helpfully laid out that, look, these are not market prices that the Medicare program is paying. There are all sorts of things that the Medicare program does that inflates the prices that it pays above what we would see in a market. And if you're ever wondering about the effect that all of those provisions of the Medicare program have on drug prices, there's a very simple thought experiment that can clarify what the effect of those provisions is. Imagine the Medicare program took all $1 trillion that it was going to spend on behalf of beneficiaries, and instead of giving them using that money to give them health insurance, just gave enrollees the money and then let them buy their own health insurance and pay for their medications themselves. What would happen to drug prices in that scenario? I think most economists would agree. I'd be interested to hear what our panelists have to say about this question. But I think most economists would agree that drug prices would fall from their current levels, or at least drug prices for Medicare enrollees. That suggests that Medicare is paying above market prices for drugs. Next, the IRA, contrary to the claims of opponents of the IRA, doesn't impose price controls on prescription drugs or coerce drug manufacturers or tax manufacturers, because as the courts keep reminding those manufacturers, participation in the Medicare program is entirely voluntary for them. It is not coercive in any way. They can always back out of the Medicare program with some months' notice, but the fact that they can back out of the Medicare program, the participation is voluntary, means that the government is not coercing them. What's happening is they are getting above market prices for their products, and they want to keep getting above market prices for their products, and so they are complaining about any statutory or other changes that would reduce the subsidies that they are getting from government. Another important clarifying point is that you'll hear in this debate that reducing the prices that Medicare pays for prescription drugs will reduce research and development into new drugs, and any reduction in that sort of research and development and innovation is bad. And I think that that's a myth. It might be bad, but we don't know. And Pragya and her co-authors have something to say on this in their paper. But it is not per se bad if innovation falls, because we might be in that zone where we are getting too much innovation, and that's an important question that we have to explore. But it's important to reject the claim that any reduction in innovation is necessarily bad. And while it is historic what the Medicare program is doing, the Congress has allowed the program to negotiate lower drug prices directly with pharmaceutical manufacturers. I would hesitate to call this a success, because what it means that after almost 60 years, and it will be 60 years before any of the IRA negotiated prices will take effect, 60 years of Medicare's operation before any of those negotiated or lower prices take effect. What it means is that Congress has taken that long before it has done anything this serious about trying to get those prices down. I don't think that's an indication that the Medicare program is a good price negotiator. I think it indicates quite the opposite. And then finally, we have to keep in mind it might not work. Those price reductions have not taken effect yet. And you remember I mentioned, there we go. Remember I mentioned these growth projections for Medicare prescription drug spending in 2024 through 2026. That accelerated growth in Medicare prescription drug spending is in part a result of the Inflation Reduction Act and the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that will tend to increase Medicare spending on prescription drugs. The IRA, like many other healthcare bills that Congress has passed, takes sort of a dessert first, spinach later approach to Medicare spending. It front loads additional subsidies that have that will have the effect of increasing Medicare spending, in some cases increasing the prices that Medicare pays for prescription drugs, with the promise of fiscal restraint later on. The spinach will come later. We promise that in 2026 and the out years, we will really clamp down on unnecessary Medicare spending and excessive drug prices. It remains to be seen whether that is going to happen, because we have seen this before in the Affordable Care Act and in other laws that Congress has passed, where they have promised austerity, but not yet. So the Affordable Care Act created a lot of subsidies for the health industry, with the promise of reducing spending on Medicare Advantage plans. In reducing spending through something that they called an Independent Payment Advisory Board, or IPAB, and a change in the tax code that we call the Cadillac tax that would ultimately reduce spending on employer-sponsored insurance. But when Congress passes these sorts of spinach later proposals or spinach later provisions, what that does is it gives the industry time to go to work in the courts and go to work in lobbying the bureaucracy and go to work lobbying Congress to defang those provisions and make sure that they never have the hoped for effect of reducing Medicare spending. In the case of the Affordable Care Act cuts to Medicare Advantage, the health insurance industry, the beneficiary of Medicare Advantage spending, was able to defang those cuts by going to the Medicare program and persuading them to provide quality bonuses to mediocre health plans, mediocre Medicare Advantage health plans, which meant that those cuts had much less bite. The healthcare industry writ large went to Congress and got Congress to repeal both the Cadillac tax and the Independent Payment Advisory Board. So this sort of dessert first, spinach later approach to reducing healthcare spending often doesn't work. It remains to be seen whether it will work in this case. And lest you doubt the might of the healthcare industry and their influence on Capitol Hill, keep in mind these numbers from Open Secrets, which portray lobbying or expenditures on lobbying Congress by sector. And what they show is that the health sector of the economy spends almost 6 times as much lobbying Congress as the defense industry. The defense industry, which is almost 6 times as much. The pharmaceutical sector, or the pharmaceutical industry alone spends 2 to 3 times as much as the entire defense industry does lobbying Congress. This is a very effective lobby that is very used to getting what it wants from Capitol Hill, and it's so brazen that if you remember, if you watched the Super Bowl this year, and I did, I'm not a football fan, but I watched the Super Bowl. I watched the Super Bowl for the healthcare ads. This year, I watched the Super Bowl, and the healthcare industry did not disappoint. Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, 5 months after the Medicare program announced that it would try to reduce the prices that it pays for Pfizer's drug Eliquis that it manufactures with Bristol Myers Squibb. Pfizer bought a 60-second ad during the Super Bowl, not a 30-second ad, a 60-second ad during the Super Bowl where it blared at audiences, at the television audience, the Queen song, "Don't Stop Me Now Because I'm Having a Good Time." Incidentally, this ad, estimates are that this ad set Pfizer back about $10 to $20 million. That is a drop in the bucket in terms of the money that Pfizer spends lobbying Congress, and that's an expenditure that did not appear, it would not appear in the numbers I showed you before. Interestingly, I found in researching this particular slide that Charles Pfizer and Charles Earhart, who were co-founders of Pfizer, were cousins, and interestingly, later on, also in-laws. So I'll leave you to unpack that. Well, I now cede the floor to Pragya so that she can talk to us about her paper. Oh, I'm sorry, Luca is going to go first. Can talk to us about his paper on the Bipartisan Budget Act and its effect on Medicare coverage and prices for biosimilars. Luca.
Thank you, Michael. So thank you all. This is, I'm going to talk today about a paper, the paper that Michael introduced. This is work I want to mention with my co-author, who's also named Luca, and is a former graduate student at Duke University and currently at Charles Rivers Associates. So this is about benefit design and biosimilar coverage in Medicare Part D. And before I start, just so everyone is on the same page, biosimilars are these sort of newer drug products that are supposed to be near identical copies of these really complicated called biological drugs. These are drugs that are grown on organic tissue. They use a lot of advanced technologies like recombinant DNA. And these are not the usual little pills that you think about, or Lipitor, you know, like Lipitor or other drugs like that, whose formula you can just write down if you've taken chemistry in high school. These are much more complicated and cannot be reproduced exactly. And so a few years ago, with the Affordable Care Act, the Congress passed a pathway for these drugs that are not quite identical, but close enough to be launched on the US market to generate some competition with these originator biologics, which otherwise would have essentially continued as monopolies for as long as people were willing to buy them. How do I move forward? That is a
big green button.
Big green button. So this paper starts,
This one.
oh, big green button. There was also a smaller green button.
Yeah.
So this paper started like, I think most satisfying intellectual exercises with a puzzle. And the puzzle is that Medicare plans are much less likely to cover biosimilars than commercial plans. So think employer-sponsored insurance plans. If you look at this graph here in this slide, when a biosimilar first launches, it gets covered for about half of patients who are enrolled in a employer-sponsored insurance plan, but for almost nobody who's on a Medicare Part D plan. And then throughout the first 3 years of a biosimilar's life, that distance in levels remains pretty much the same. So by the third year, about half of patients in Medicare Part D plans have access through their plans to one of these biosimilar products, whereas almost everyone who's in an employer-sponsored plan has access to it. And that's sort of funny, right? At the end of the day, Medicare Part D plans are privately administered. Those are private insurance companies. Most of the time, they are the same companies that are offering the employer-sponsored plans. And this is the coverage of the biosimilars. We can look at sort of the other side of that coin and ask the question, what about the originator biologic, the drug that these biosimilars are copying? So if we do that, and here we have the advantage that we can also look at what the coverage level before the biosimilar enters and then see how it changes after the launch of the biosimilar product. And we see that with some variation, shown here with the error bars, Medicare Part D plans essentially keep on covering the originator biologic at the same exact rate than they were before, whereas employer-sponsored plans slowly pare back coverage of the originator biologic in favor, presumably, of the biosimilar, so that after about 3 years again, employer-sponsored plans are about 20 to 30% less likely to cover the originator biologic than a Medicare Part D plan. And again, this is kind of a puzzle, right? Same insurance companies are designing these plans. They're just designing them for different markets. So what is different? To think about that, we want to go and think about the benefit design of Medicare Part D. What does Part D cover and how? And this is a long story because Medicare Part D launched actually not so long ago in 2006. And the initial Medicare Part D benefit design, which is common to all plans, had four phases. A deductible phase, where beneficiaries are paying for 100% of drug-related expenses. An initial coverage phase, where the plan is responsible for 75% of the spending, and the beneficiary is responsible for 25% of the spending. Then there is a coverage gap, which essentially goes back to the first phase and puts all the spending burden on patients. And then finally, for patients that have a lot of drug spending, there's a catastrophic coverage phase where the plan is responsible for only 15%. The federal government steps in, with what is called the federal reinsurance program that covers 80% of spending. And then the beneficiary is paying 5%, although there is no cap. So 5% of drug spending for some patients can be quite a lot of money. So the design the initial design of Medicare Part D had sort of immediately some people being worried, especially about the coverage gap, which created a lot of out-of-pocket costs for patients. And so in 2011, the Affordable Care Act redesigned the Medicare Part D plan and created, and essentially they tried to close this coverage gap, which by the way is also occasionally known as the donut hole. And the way it did this was by imposing a 50% manufacturer discount. So this is money that doesn't come from the plan and doesn't come from the government, but it comes from drug manufacturers. And so drug manufacturers had to provide a 50% discount on their drugs for patients who were receiving them while being in the coverage gap. For generics and biosimilars, which were generally thought of as cheaper products, the Affordable Care Act initially imposed essentially just a small redesign. They had plans cover a 7% of the total, while beneficiaries would remain responsible for 93%. This was not a static redesign. It would change over time, And so every year, the plans would cover a little bit more of both branded drugs and generics and biosimilars in the coverage gap, so that by 2018, keeping the 50% manufacturer discount right where it was, plans would have to pay 15% coinsurance on branded drugs and 56% of the costs for generics and biosimilars. This did not touch the catastrophic coverage phase. This happened later. But before we get there, there's so many redesigns that sometimes it's hard to keep them straight. In 2019, the Bipartisan Budget Act increased the manufacturer discount from 50% to 70%, and increased the plan coinsurance for generics to 63%. And then one big thing that they did, which I'm highlighting here in the background, is that they moved biosimilars from the generic bucket to the branded bucket. This was done because biosimilars turned out not to be quite as cheap as generic drugs. As I sort of previewed, biologic products are much more complicated to manufacture, and the costs required to bring them to market are much higher. And so at this point, biosimilars have not quite achieved the price reductions that we'd normally associate with generics. And so biosimilars have, while more cost-effective and cheaper than the originator biologics, are still much more expensive than a generic product. So I will also point out here that there is a little bit of a strange feeling to the way that the coverage gap was filled, first through the ACA and then through the Bipartisan Budget Act. And it's that it makes plans responsible for a lot more money if a patient is using a generic product or a biosimilar product, and a lot less if the patient is using a branded product. Now, keep in mind, the branded products are usually much more expensive than generics and biosimilars, and so it's providing an incentive for the plan to keep patients on more expensive products rather than moving them to the cheaper biosimilars and generics. So that's where the IRA sort of stepped in. They got rid completely of the coverage gap, and instead, they sort of put it together with the initial coverage phase. Now the plan, starting in 2025, the plan will be responsible for 65% of drug costs in this middle phase. There's going to be a 10% manufacturer discount, no longer a 70%. Beneficiaries are going to be responsible for 25% of the coinsurance. And then the other thing that the IRA does, it steps in and also reform the catastrophic coverage phase. And it did so by dramatically reducing the size of the federal reinsurance program down from 80% to 20%, and increasing instead the burden on the plan, which now covers 60%, and the manufacturer, which now pays a 20% discount. Notice that after the initial coverage phase, what also has disappeared is the 5% out-of-pocket cost that patients were paying, and that's because of the, I think, highly publicized out-of-pocket maximum that the IRA has also implemented, so that patients no longer have essentially potentially infinite outlays. So there's a lot to digest here, but I think we can take two takeaways away from these repeated redesigns. One is that before the BBA, Part D plans preferred covering branded drugs relative to biosimilar drugs, also relative to generic drugs, but generics are so much cheaper than branded drugs that usually didn't make wasn't enough of a disincentive to switch completely patients from generics to branded. And the second is that before the Inflation Reduction Act, because of the federal reinsurance program, Part D plans only bore a small fraction of the cost of drugs used by high-spending patients. And so they probably cared a lot less than an employer-sponsored plans about the cost of really expensive drugs, because they knew that if a patient was using a lot of drugs and a lot of very expensive drugs, the federal government would step in and pay that bill. And the IRA, that sort of is no longer is the case. How does this apply to biosimilars? Well, biosimilars are sort of more cost-effective versions of some of these really high-priced drugs. And so our analysis speculates, or our hypothesis is that the BBA would lead to increased coverage of biosimilars thanks to the reallocation of biosimilars drugs from the generic bucket to the branded bucket, which made them eligible for the manufacturer discount. And the same will happen thanks to the IRA, this time because plans are going to be much more sensitive about the cost of these high-priced drugs for all of their patients that are in the catastrophic coverage phase. Now, we don't have data for the IRA because that's going to happen next year, but we do have some data for the BBA. And so what we can see here is that if we look at the fraction of patients in Medicare Part D plans that receive coverage for these biosimilar products, it's pretty flat. All of these coefficients are relative to the Q4 of 2018, right before the BBA was implemented. And that line is very flat and then suddenly ticks up. And so we think that that is the effect of the BBA. It's giving the right incentives, or at least better incentives for plans to coverage biosimilars, and we see that plans are responding. And so that coverage rate is increasing by about 20%, which you can interpret as having 20% more patients for whom the biosimilar is an available option. And I will add, this is the extent of our analysis, I will add two caveats. One is that our results apply only to benefit design reforms. And so there are a lot of other things that are happening in the IRA. Michael talked about some of them. Pragya will talk about others, like price negotiations. And there are provisions here that could also affect plan strategic choices. But insofar as we speak about benefit design reform, we believe that this is a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Pragya?
Great. All right, great. All right, thank you so much, Michael and Luca. Hi, everyone. As Michael mentioned, my name is Pragya. I'm an assistant professor at Weill Cornell, and I'm a health economist. And I'm excited to be back at the Cato Institute after 12 years hiatus. So thank you so much for inviting us, Michael. So Michael gave us great background on the landscape of prescription drug spending in Medicare in general, as well as an overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. And Luca gave us some insight on how the Inflation Reduction Act's provisions related to plan responsibility in the catastrophic phase are likely to increase plans' incentives to reduce spending. I'm going to talk about a paper that we published in Nature Biotech that thinks about the price negotiation policy embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act and takes seriously the main counter-argument against this provision, which is that it's going to decimate pharmaceutical innovation. And before I get into it, I want to pause there to say that this is, a reasonable concern. We know that innovation has been really important for improving health outcomes over time, and so it's important that we encourage the right level of innovation, and so take this argument seriously. Before I dive into what we did, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Matt Vogel, Amitabh Chandra from Harvard, and Reena Conti from BU. Matt really did a lot of the heavy lifting for this work, so deserves a lot of the credit, but I'm happy to be here riding his coattails. So what we're going to ask what we ask in this paper is what the likely impact of the IRA is to be on incentives for innovation. And in particular, we're going to ask two questions. One is, how much will the IRA reduce pharmaceutical revenues? And when I say the IRA, I really mean the price negotiation feature. As we've talked about, there's so many other features of the IRA. We really honed in on this one feature. And to answer that, we did a thought experiment where we asked how much of 2022 global pharmaceutical revenues would have been impacted by the IRA had it been in effect for a very long time, and so had been in its steady state of operations, which is a reasonable simulation for what we might expect how much we might expect pharmaceutical revenues to be affected. And then the second question we asked is what's a reasonable upper bound on the IRA's price negotiation, or the impact of the IRA's price negotiation feature on the present value of pipeline products. And so this is different from its impact on revenues because the price negotiation features sort of happen late in a product's life cycle, and so have a different impact on the present value of a pipeline product when an investor is deciding whether or not to invest in it than they do on revenues. And we wanted to take the counter argument really seriously and think about what is like the maximum possible impact that it could have. And so we asked how this provision of the IRA would impact the present value of a small molecule drug, which is the opposite of what Luca talked about when he was talking about biologics, which faced price negotiation earlier in their product life cycle, with really high exposure to Medicare, so they're going to be really impacted by the IRA or more than other drugs, and that was going to be negotiated with certainty. So somehow the investor knows at the time of investment that it's going to get negotiated by Medicare. And so, we answer these two questions to try to understand the impact of price negotiation on innovation. So what is it that we do? So essentially, like I alluded to, we basically assume that the IRA had been in effect from before 2012 onwards, and we estimate, or we figure out what drugs would have been negotiated under those assumptions and what share of pharmaceutical revenue they represent. And so just to review those rules for what is eligible for negotiation, Michael did a little bit of this, but I'll spend a little bit more time on it. The drug has to be a branded drug. It has to have Medicare expenditures over $200 million. It has to be on the market for at least 9 years for small molecules and 13 years for biologics. And it can't have faced any generic or biosimilar competition. And there are also some other exemptions for certain special types of products, plasma-derived products, products that are only approved for rare diseases or orphan diseases, and products that are manufactured by small biotech firms. So you can already tell there's, a relatively small subset of drugs that are going to be eligible for Medicare price negotiation. And then we simulate each year what those drugs would be. And so in 2015, we find that there would be about 50 drugs that would be eligible for negotiation. And then each year, additional drugs are added, but also some additional drugs are dropped as generic and biosimilars enter the market. And so negotiation is no longer in effect. And so by 2022, we have an estimated 74 drugs that we think would have been under IRA price negotiation, holding all else equal about firm behavior. And so what share of global pharmaceutical revenues does this represent? And this sort of pie chart gives you the answer. So global pharmaceutical revenues in 2022 were $1.2 trillion. Of that, only 43 billion are from the drugs in 2022 that would have been subject to price negotiation had the policy been in effect for many years. And there's, actually a significant portion of firms that have no drugs that are subject to Medicare price negotiation. So about $400 billion is from firms that are not affected at all. And so this means 4% of global revenues, approximately, are exposed to Medicare price negotiation. But remember, I told you these are the Medicare revenues for the drugs exposed to price negotiation. Price negotiation is unlikely to drop the price to zero. And so if we take the CBO's estimate that it's going to drop the price 50%, that means a 2% reduction in global revenues. And so already you can kind of see this is a small drop in the bucket relative to global pharmaceutical revenues. And so you're already thinking this is unlikely to make a big impact on innovation. But we wanted to ask, are there certain products where it might make a really big impact? And so one class of products that the pharmaceutical industry has been very worried about is small molecule drugs. And this is an article from one of the lobbying groups representing biotech and venture capital that makes this point that the IRA is going to make small molecule R&D uninvestable, because they argue that the majority of the revenue of a product comes after 9 years. And so it's going to have a huge impact on pharmaceutical revenues and therefore harm innovation. And so we wanted to take this case seriously and think about the case of a small molecule that might be very affected by the IRA, and what, from an investor's perspective at the pipeline stage, the impact on the net present value of the product would be as a result. And so we stipulate, or we consider the case of a small molecule product. Again, it's negotiated in 9 years instead of 13 for biologics. And then we also thought about a product that has unusually high exposure to Medicare. And so its revenues are more likely to be affected by the IRA than other products. So we assume 2/3 of the revenues come from the US, whereas the average is around 40%. And then we assume 2/3 of the US revenues come from Medicare, and we know from Michael that about 1/3 of US revenues come from Medicare. So these are high relative to the average drug. And then we also assume that the prices would go down 67% instead of 50%, which is the CBO estimate. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we assume that the pipeline project is known to be negotiated with certainty at the investment stage, which is a pretty bold assumption to make. There's a lot of uncertainty at that time about when generic entry is going to happen, how successful the product is going to be. But we wanted to give pharma the full benefit of the doubt in this analysis. And so what do we find? So this is a picture that shows you a stylized sort of revenue over a product's lifespan, from 1 year post-launch to 13 years post-launch. That looks sort of similar to what you saw from the pharmaceutical industry article, and the portion that's lost from negotiation. And if you if you estimate the present value of that amount that's lost to negotiation, it's about an 11% decrease. And so it's not trivial, and there probably are some drugs for which that is going to make a difference at the margin about whether or not you choose to invest, but it's also not catastrophic. And this was for a drug that has sort of, we made unusual, unreasonable, some would say, assumptions about how affected it would be by the IRA. And so to summarize, what we conclude is that the IRA price negotiation feature specifically is unlikely to have a big effect on innovation incentives. As we noted, the IRA is going to impact probably less than 4% of global pharmaceutical revenues had it been in effect in 2022, holding all else equal. And it has a limited effect on the net present value of pipeline projects, partly because the negotiations happen late in the product life cycle, and partly because it has a limited impact on global sales. And we calculated that it would only be an 11% reduction in the present value of revenue for this unusual case of a small molecule drug with really high exposure to Medicare that's going to be negotiated with certainty. And the last point I want to make is that, even the negotiations only end up impacting drugs that end up having high gross sales. And so to the extent that pharmaceutical revenue is somewhat predictable, these are the drugs that are less likely to have been on the margin in the first place for whether or not an investor would want to invest in them. And so for that reason as well, it's also unlikely that the price negotiation would impact innovation incentives by a lot. So I want to conclude with some caveats. So in this paper, we really only studied the price negotiation portion of the IRA. We didn't model a lot of other things, including the increased plan risk in the catastrophic phase, which we think would reduce manufacturer revenues. Also, I should note there's sort of inflation rebates that the IRA has, which would also reduce manufacturer revenues. But then there are also certain policies of the IRA that would increase manufacturer revenues. So reduction in out-of-pocket costs makes patients less price sensitive, and so is going to increase spending. There might also be some strategic responses that firms take, so they may sort of product hop from one product to another without huge innovation to sort of avoid facing negotiation, or they might enter with higher launch prices to avoid the inflation rebates, which could increase revenues. And then the last thing we sort of don't consider is any possible spillovers to other payers. Maybe other payers will see that Medicare is negotiating and clamp down. It's a little bit unclear whether this would happen and what the direction would be of that as well. All that is to say, a lot of other aspects of the IRA that we don't fully consider. And the last thing is that I think there's some uncertainty about whether or not a revenue shock to a firm is only going to impact marginal innovations. As I alluded to earlier, it's sometimes hard to know what is going to be a successful product at the stage of investing. And so we can't rule out the risk that something valuable is going to be lost because somebody didn't realize its potential. But even with those caveats, I think if I were a betting woman, I would bet that the IRA is not likely to have a huge impact on innovation.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Pragya. So I have so many questions for both of you. You raised so many interesting points and interesting questions. We have a little more than a half an hour. I imagine we're going to consume all of it. I want to start with Luca because first by praising your depiction, your graphic depicting the Medicare Part D benefit and the structure of the benefit, because it is a valiant effort to simplify a really complex benefit design that even if if you're new to health policy and you thought that was kind of complex, it is. I'm not new to health policy, and I still thought that depiction itself was complex, but it attempts to describe a situation that is even more complex than that. So it was a very useful graphic to have, and I want to thank you for that. But I want to ask you about something that was in your paper that you didn't discuss, which is Table 1. Mm-hmm. You remember Table 1?
I remember Table 1.
Okay. Table 1 depicts pricing and spending on filgrastim. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Maybe no one knows how to pronounce it. This is a biologic product that stimulates white blood cell production, so it's very important to HIV patients and chemotherapy patients. There is a branded version, Neupogen, and a biosimilar, Zarxio. And what you depict in Table 1 there is that a situation that I believe the Affordable Care Act created, where in 2018, you had these two products that were basically the same thing. They're basically the same products. But the way that Congress structured the Part D coverage for these two products is that even though the brand name Neupogen costs the taxpayer about $8,000 more, Congress structured the Medicare Part D coverage so that both the plans and the enrollees had an incentive to choose the drug that cost taxpayers $8,000 more. Again, same product, basically same product. One of them cost taxpayers $8,000 more, and both the plans and the enrollees themselves saved money if they chose the thing that was more expensive to the taxpayers. I think the individual enrollee saved like $2,000 and the plan saved $3,000. So, couple questions about that. First, how do you turn that into a graphic? You got to turn that into a graphic because it's going to be magnificent once you do. Second, does this make any economic sense whatsoever? Or is this, it seems not to make any economic sense. It seems like the donut hole, which is where Congress offers structures drug coverage so that there's a deductible, and then there's some coverage, and then the coverage disappears. And then there's more coverage. Is this like the donut hole? I mean, does the situation with filgrastim make any economic sense whatsoever? What was going on there?
I mean, probably not, but a lot of things don't make economic sense. If everything made economic sense, I'd be out of a job. So I think it comes from two elements of the benefit design. The first is the manufacturer discount that was applied through the ACA to the branded version, so Neupogen, and not to Zarxio, the biosimilar version. So that discount made the product, the more expensive product, cheaper for both plans and payers.
Now, when you say manufacturer discount, you're talking about a statutory requirement that the manufacturer of the branded version offer a lower price or accept a lower price in that coverage gap, whereas the manufacturer of the biosimilar did not have to offer
Yes.
that lower price.
And that discount is based on, is off of a price that is set at the US level. So the biosimilar manufacturer or the branded manufacturer did not have the option of setting a price specifically for patients in the coverage gap. So there was very little room, say, for the biosimilar manufacturer to lower the price just for patients in the coverage gap. So that was element one. And then the second element was there even before the ACA, and it's the fact that a lot of the cost of these expensive drugs accrues in the catastrophic coverage phase, and the government is paying most of that. And so the combination of these two factors made it so in the specific case that you're referring to in Table 1, the more expensive product, Neupogen, was cheaper to both the plan and the patient because the government was picking up the difference and some.
You said that economically irrational things happen all the time. Are
Yeah.
you aware of a private insurer who's ever designed drug coverage or coverage for anything else this way?
Well, I mean, if you look at my, the short answer is yes, in the sense that maybe not as often, but if you look at the graphics that I had at the beginning, there are plenty of employer-sponsored plans that still cover the originator biologic and don't cover the biosimilar. So this happens also in private insurance. There's a lot of reasons why the specific case of biosimilars and biologics is complex. I believe that at the beginning, these are new products, first of all. The first biosimilar was launched in 2015. Notice, by the way, that that's 5 years after the ACA reform. So in a sense, I think we call this an inadvertent effect of the ACA, because we're not entirely sure that there was foresight in thinking of what's going to happen 5 years down the line, given that we have this benefit design structure in place. But to go back to your original point, these things do happen also in private insurance plans, and it's because maybe there's patients and providers that maybe prefer the originator biologic because they're more used to it. And there might be a reluctance sometimes to switch a patient that has been doing well on a maintenance biologic originator to the biosimilar, even though my limited understanding of clinical evidence suggests that these two types of products are by and large equivalent.
So there might be situations where an employer-sponsored plan covers the branded but not the biosimilar, but if they cover both, they're making an implicit judgment that we think these are basically the same. It would surprise me to learn that an employer that would bear the cost, at least in the short term, of the higher drug, of the higher priced drug, would encourage enrollees to go to that one rather than one the employer or the PBM thinks is the same. And so I wonder, so when I see something that looks that economically irrational cropping up in Medicare Part D, I wonder, is it as inadvertent as you say? Or were the lobbyists for the biologics innovators well aware that, wait a second, if we lobby Congress to tweak the discounts just this way for us and not for the biosimilars, and then we have Congress pick up this much in the catastrophic phase, Are we going to create this situation where everybody involved is going to want to increase government spending to our benefit?
I'm not a lobbyist expert. I don't know what conversations were going on at the time.
Those memos must exist somewhere. We'll have to.
But I will say that biosimilars did not exist when the mandatory manufacturer discount was put in place, and did not exist for 5 years after that. So it is possible that this is just something that happened and that Congress or CMS realized and then tried to fix later on.
Okay. Pragya, you mentioned that there will be a fall off in innovation, but that it's not likely to be meaningful. Is it fair to summarize your findings as, for all the sound and fury that we hear from drug manufacturers about the effect of the negotiating provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, this is really just small potatoes?
Yeah. So I think the short answer is yes. That is an accurate summary of the paper with regards to the price negotiation feature specifically. I think the fact that the negotiations happen very late in the product lifespan, and that they only affect the U.S., and within the U.S. they only affect Medicare. And a lot of drugs are not eligible for price negotiation, either because they're less than $200 million of Medicare revenue or because they're already facing generic or biosimilar competition, really, I think, mitigates the effect that the price negotiation feature is going to have on innovation. Now, there are other aspects of the IRA that pharma companies also get angry about. In particular, I think that there's the inflation rebate, which says that firms need to pay back any price increases that they have over inflation. And so, they claim that the combination of those two things, and that is, across the product life cycle, not just late. They claim that the combination of those two things is going to meaningfully impact innovation. But, and so I think industry reports sort of estimate that in the next 20 years or so, you're going to have like 140 fewer drugs, which would be like 15% reduction in the number of drugs that you would have, which is just like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher than what CBO estimates, which is 5 to 10 over that same time period. So I think we only consider the price negotiation feature, and I think that is probably not going to make a big difference. Maybe there's a bigger difference if you consider some of the other features, but my sense is probably not.
Worth mentioning at this point, perhaps, that when the economist Sam Peltzman looked at the effects of the FDA's efficacy standard, which Congress imposed on all new drugs in 1962, he estimated there was a drop-off in new drug introductions of about 50 to 60%, which swamps even the worst predictions about the effect of the IRA on the pipeline of new drugs. Just interesting to put that in perspective. But at some point, if CMS negotiates lower prices for 10 drugs starting in 2026, and then another 15 in 27, and another 15 in 28, and another 20, is it, in 29, at some point, this has to it would seem that at some point this is going to have a meaningful impact on innovation. Once it's not just these 10 drugs, how many, where does it become meaningful? And I'll have some more questions about that. But one part of this question that I'm asking is, what was the total number of drugs that you were looking at in your study?
So we looked at all branded drugs. So I think a little bit less than 1,000.
Okay.
Yeah. So at what point does it become meaningful? So I think as the regulation sits itself, like right now, there's going to come a point where, there aren't that many drugs that are newly eligible for negotiation that haven't already been negotiated. And I think even if the price were to come down to 80% or higher, it wouldn't make a big difference on the net present value because it is so far out into the product life cycle. That being said, if the regulation changed or there was new regulation that said we're going to negotiate launch prices of drugs or sort of apply drug negotiation earlier in the product life cycle, I think then you could potentially have more meaningful impacts on innovation. Now, I think there's still this question that you laid out at the beginning of whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't think we have a clear answer as to whether we are sort of over-incentivizing innovation or under-incentivizing innovation and where that sort of sweet spot is.
One of the comparisons or claims that you discuss in your paper is you write, some have argued that Medicare negotiation for a small molecule is the equivalent of generic entry. We're talking about the magnitudes of the potential fall off in revenues and innovation. Can you respond to that claim?
Yeah, so I think, pharma in general is very concerned about price negotiations, and generic entry is something that's, really decimates the revenue of a branded product. I think it reduces branded product revenue by 80% or more. And so they're comparing Medicare price negotiation, which, has the potential to reduce prices in Medicare by 50% or more to that sort of catastrophic event, at least when it comes to branded manufacturer revenues. I think this is a bit of hyperbole because generic entry affects all markets in the U.S. when it happens, and when it happens in the U.S., it also tends to happen in other countries. So in some sense, it's a global event. Whereas the IRA only affects the U.S. and it only affects Medicare. So it has a much smaller effect on the branded manufacturer's overall revenue than generic entry does. And so I think it's a nice rhetorical trick, but when you peel the onion, you find that it's unfair.
So let's talk a moment about, first, a quick question. Your study lends itself to updating as more and more data come in. Do you plan to be updating it?
Yeah, so that is a good point. I think one of the things we're going to learn more about as the negotiations happen is how much the price negotiations actually reduce prices. I think there's uncertainty about that, and so I think that's a parameter that we might consider updating. But I think that it's not going to change the fundamental results of the paper. Even if prices went to zero, like the net present value in that stylized example that I gave you would decrease like 15% instead of 11%. And so I don't think that the new information we're going to get under the current policy regime is going to make a big difference. I think one of the things I am really interested, though, in is understanding how manufacturers are going to respond strategically to the various provisions of the IRA. In our paper, we sort of assumed that nothing changes about the drugs that enter, the price they enter at, and I think that's, in reality, an oversimplification. And so that's where my interest is right now.
I wanted to get into how the industry might respond, because as I alluded at the beginning, there are ways that it can try to avoid eating its spinach, as it were. It can go to the courts, it can go to the bureaucracy, it can go to Congress, but it can also do things out in the marketplace. And you mentioned in your paper that that all of the price discrimination strategies that they currently use, the drug industry currently uses, will still be available to it. And you note that while the Inflation Reduction Act limits the ability of drug manufacturers to increase their prices once those drugs are on the market, if they want to participate in Medicare, they have to accept those limits on price increases. It does nothing to control the prices that they set when they launch their drugs. So my question for you is, what might the drug industry, or drug manufacturers, be able to do with that freedom to launch prices and the freedom to price discriminate that might undermine what Congress is trying to accomplish by having Medicare negotiate these prices?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of things that firms could do to respond strategically. You talked about sort of the political economy issues of lobbying against the implementation of the law, which is happening as we speak. In terms of other things they could do, I mentioned evergreening, so sort of launching new products that are minimally innovative to sort of avoid the 9-year time horizon for price negotiation, or 13 years for biologics. And then there is this other concern that drugs might actually enter at higher prices. And I think the main cause of that incentive is the inflation rebate. And I think they can do this without penalty in the other markets that they operate in, because they can continue to give price discounts to commercial payers or to other federal payers or other countries, but have higher launch prices nonetheless. They may also have incentives to do that, because that might sort of, if they think they're going to face negotiation down the road, having a higher launch price to start with now might increase their expected price post-negotiation as well, though that is uncertain. So I am very curious to understand to what extent that happens.
A question for both of you. Pragya writes, and her co-authors write that, and I think you noted here, that there will be a fall-off in innovation, and it will not only be in marginal or net harmful even innovation. We will likely see a fall-off in beneficial innovation as well, cost-effective drug innovations. So my question for both of you is the reduction, is that going to be random? Is it going to be an equal reduction in both the beneficial and the net costly innovation? Or will it skew toward the net costly stuff? So that, and if so, what is the mechanism for that?
Yeah.
How would that happen? How would it come to pass that it might not be random, but might?
Yeah.
We would see more of a drop off in the net harmful stuff, or the net costly stuff.
So if pharmaceutical revenues are predictable at the time when an investor is making a decision, and the revenues correlate with the social value that they provide, then firms are less likely to give up projects that are going to be beneficial to society when there's a revenue shock. And there's a really good paper out of the University of Washington that sort of looks at what happened when Medicare Part D came online, and compares the survival gains in oral cancer products versus infused cancer products that are not affected by Part D, and found that there was new innovation in oral products, but the benefits of those new innovations were less than they were pre-Part D. And so that is suggestive that on average it is, revenue shocks do affect marginal innovations. But there is, the assumptions that I laid out are definitely flawed. There is a level of uncertainty about how successful a drug is going to be, and how much money the drug makes is also not totally correlated with the social value that it provides. And there's work showing that Wall Street forecasts of how much money a product is going to make before it launches are far from perfectly predictive of what they actually make, just to illustrate that level of uncertainty that exists. So the way I think about it is on average, it's going to affect marginal innovations more, but there is a risk that it affects something meaningful. And it's a question, how much do we want to protect against that risk by overpaying now? Luca, do you have anything to add?
I have only one thing to add, which is we don't know a lot about innovation. I think we know a lot more about how prices and, in general, coverage restrictions for drugs affect utilization. But we know very, very little about how shocks to companies' revenue affects what kind of projects they push forward, and how they make these decisions. Pragya mentioned predictability of revenue. I think predictability of revenue is an open question, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the companies only find out relatively late in the development life cycle what kind of product they have in their hand, and sometimes they don't realize it until they actually hit the market. The PCSK9 drugs, they're so-called superstatins. I think the companies thought they were going to be massive blockbusters, and then it turns out that they're much more expensive than statins, regular statins, which are now generic. And statins work pretty well for almost everyone. And so insurance companies have been very wary of switching patients on what are effective and relatively safe medications to these less tested and much more expensive drugs that may potentially only have a marginal benefit.
Okay. Thank you. So Cato scholar John Early, who is watching our program online, asks, why not go back to Michael's original question? Why not give beneficiaries their share of the $1 trillion and let them buy coverage? Thank you, John, for that question. And because that is a question I had, I sort of raised it hypothetically before. What would happen to prices for drugs for Medicare enrollees if Medicare operated like Social Security and just gave them cash and trusted them to spend it? And I would even stipulate that they would, the Medicare enrollees would get not the average amount that Medicare, not $16,000, the average amount that Medicare spends per enrollee, but a Medicare check that the program adjusts for income, so that lower income people get bigger checks and wealthier people get smaller checks. And for risk as well, there's a risk adjustment program in the Medicare in the Medicare Advantage program that tries to get to Medicare Advantage plans additional subsidies so that they will get something resembling an actuarially fair payment for the people they are enrolling. Use that to calibrate the Medicare checks that the enrollees get, so that healthy and wealthy people get smaller checks, poorer and sicker people get bigger checks. Do that. Send it to the Medicare enrollees. What happens to the prices for drugs that Medicare enrollees get, the Medicare enrollees use?
You want to go first?
Would you like me to go first? I can go first. So it's very hard. Let me start by saying it's very hard to predict what's going to happen to prices, largely because I think it would then depend on what kind of infrastructure we have on the insurance side for offering plans to Medicare beneficiaries. Does it look like what it looks like today? Does it look like something more like employer-sponsored health insurance, or does it look like the health exchanges? All of those architectural, like economic architectural questions will matter a lot more for the price of drugs than whether the money is given from the government to the plan or from the patients to the plans. Well, then let's assume
that they are 100% price sensitive, both when it comes to the question of whether to buy coverage and then at the margin purchasing additional coverage or not.
So it's quite possible that prices will go down, but it's a little bit hard for me to predict that now. There's a lot of variables, but I think I would generally agree with what I think is your assessment, which is that prices will go down. I will say sort of two things to step back and think about the bigger picture. And one is that if our goal, I don't think has to be only to reduce spending. We have to think about what we buy with the money we spend. And there's worse and better ways of purchasing drugs. And then the second point is that I think your question comes from the point of view that it's better to give unconditional cash transfers than to sort of paternalistic way purchase health insurance for patients. And I will sort of spend a word in favor of the paternalistic approach here, which I'm sure is a very popular view, right? This is the right forum for this. We have a lot of evidence that patients have very poor decision making in terms of how they trade off money and healthcare or health. And we know that small increases in copays and cost sharing in general lead to large reductions in sometimes life-saving care. There's now a body of evidence, including a recent paper by one of Pragya's co-authors, Amitabh Chandra, shows that there are effects even on mortality rates, that patients that have what we think are very small changes in cost sharing die at higher rates. And so this then makes us think, I think as a society, about what we want to provide for patients, and that's where the economics stops, and that those are questions that sort of go beyond and make us think about what is the right objective function for a government or for a social planner.
So definitely people make mistakes, and that includes the policymakers come up with wacky benefit designs that include donut holes and encourage people to purchase a more expensive item over the less expensive one. Pragya, did you want to weigh in on this Medicare checks idea?
Yeah. So I think I generally agree with Luca, and I think, I do think prices probably would come down when individuals and firms are fully incentivized and face the cost of their healthcare utilization. But I don't know if they would be correct or socially optimal. And part of that is for the reasons that Luca mentioned, that patients have a really hard time choosing the right plan for them. Patients make very silly choices about what plans they choose. They also have a hard time valuing drugs, and so I'm not sure that the prices that a market would determine would actually reflect the social value. And then there maybe a couple other points. One is, part of the reason that we have a government-sponsored or subsidized health insurance system is because of adverse selection that would otherwise happen when there's asymmetric information between a patient who knows more about their health and what they need and a plan, even if the plan doesn't have to do community rating or any of that and can charge prices specific to the person. And so I think that is an economic argument in favor of a subsidized system as opposed to one where you're entirely just you're not subsidized at all. And then the other thing is there are positive externalities to innovation for other people and other markets, but also for future people. Like when a drug goes generic, it becomes a lot cheaper, and probably the social benefits sort of way outweigh the cost of the drug. And so it's really hard to know what is the optimal price, and I don't think a market where individuals are only thinking about their self-interest would necessarily deliver that. But I do agree with the premise that prices would probably come down.
And it brings me back to a general impression that I shared with you about this whole debate over Medicare drug pricing. It is fascinating to me that the debate is centered mostly on innovation. The objections to reducing the prices that Medicare pays are not that. They're mostly about the effect that would have on the pipeline of new treatments and cures, and what's curious about that to me is that when Lyndon Johnson sat down to sign the original Medicare bill, the original Medicare law in 1965, he didn't say, well, finally, we have something that'll solve the public goods problem involved in drug innovation. And when George W. Bush signed the Medicare Modernization Act and Part D into law in 2003, he didn't say, finally, we're solving that whole, that nasty externalities problem. That was never the purpose of Medicare. Should we be having an innovation debate in the context of entitlement policy, or should we be completely ignoring that here and say that's what patents are for? Government intervenes in the pharmaceutical market in a very significant way in order to solve this problem that everyone says they want Medicare to solve. They do it through a patent system and other forms of market exclusivities, monopolies that the government grants to drug makers. Should we just completely take those concerns out of this debate over Medicare pricing and say, if you want to encourage innovation, fine, let's have this debate about the patent system. But when it comes to Medicare, we should be trying to make sure that whatever prices Medicare is paying serve the Medicare program's goals.
I think that's what Medicare does. I don't think, as you pointed out, no one who signed a Medicare law into a Medicare Act into law was thinking about innovation incentives or was thinking that Medicare would be the driving force behind innovation incentives. So yeah, I agree with you. I will say that innovation is sort of the classic good, as Pragya, I think, has already said, that generates externalities, and those are very hard to price in a market. And so maybe that is a reason for why the government or some other, maybe even supranational organizations might want to think about innovation incentives at a higher level. You know, the US pays such high prices that end up benefiting, for example, countries all over the world, right? And so that's a problem that's hard to solve in a localized market.
Okay. And with that, I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I want to thank our speakers, our panelists, Pragya and Luca, for joining us. I want to thank all of you who joined us here in person and all of you who joined us online. And for those of you in person, you can join us for lunch upstairs in the Jaeger Conference Center. Thank you.